The estate sat like a silent fortress overlooking the neon arteries of Seoul, a monolith of polished obsidian and reinforced glass, where the only sound was the hum of high-end climate control. So Dong-won stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, his reflection a sharp, black-suited silhouette against the city's glow. He was half listening to a report on a shipment intercepted at Incheon, his expression unreadable as he calculated the cost of the betrayal. Then the rhythm of his world broke. It wasn't the sharp crack of a firearm or the frantic alert of his security detail, but a sound that shouldn't have been able to penetrate the soundproofed walls of his sanctuary, the fragile, jagged breathing of someone drowning in secret grief. So Dong-won ended the call mid-sentence, the voice of his lieutenant silenced instantly by a single tap. He moved through the hushed corridors of his home with the predatory grace of a man who had spent a decade identifying disruptions before they became threats. He followed the sound to his daughter's playroom, a space of forced innocence in a house built on shadows. The scene inside was a jagged tear in his minimalist perfection. Aisha, the young maid who usually moved through the house like a ghost, was collapsed on the floor. Her knees were pulled tightly to her chest, her head lowered as if trying to disappear into the carpet. Her arms were wrapped around herself in a desperate embrace of protection, her body shaking with a vulnerability that felt dangerously out of place in a fortress of steel. Dong-won stood in the doorway, a towering figure of controlled authority, watching the girl who had brought a human storm into his carefully guarded vacuum. Dong-won did not move, his presence filling the doorway like a growing eclipse. In his world, a person on the floor usually meant a debt unpaid or a lesson delivered. But the girl before him was neither an enemy nor a subordinate of the Syndicate. She was Aisha, the quiet shadow who ensured his daughter's world remained spotless, now reduced to a trembling heap of gray fabric and braided hair. The air in the playroom, usually smelling of expensive cedar and imported toys, was thick with the salt of her despair. "Who made a mess in my house?" His voice drifted across the room, low and resonant, carrying the weight of a command rather than a question. Aisha flinched as if struck, her head snapping up. Her eyes bloodshot and wide with a primal terror met his unreadable gaze. To her, he wasn't just an employer, he was the man who controlled the heartbeat of the city, a figure of darkness whose very silhouette signaled danger. She scrambled to find her footing, her knees sliding against the polished floor as she tried to stand, her hands shaking so violently she had to clench them into fists. "Sir, I am sorry. I didn't hear you. I will return to my duties immediately." She began to move frantically, grabbing a rag to wipe at a floor that was already clean, her movements erratic and fueled by a fear-driven retreat. Dong-won took a single step forward, the click of his Italian leather shoes echoing like a countdown. He didn't offer a hand, nor did he soften his posture. He simply watched her with a controlled and authoritative intensity that pinned her in place. "You are not cleaning, Aisha. You are shaking," he observed, his eyes tracking the way her shoulders hitched with suppressed sobs. He saw the raw, genuine grief in her expression, a look he recognized from the mirrors of his own violent past. This wasn't the flightiness of a lazy worker. This was the total collapse of a person who had reached the end of their strength. Aisha stopped, her back to him, her head bowing once more. The silence of the sterile estate seemed to press in on them both. Between the Mafia boss and the Maid, a chasm of power and wealth existed, yet in that moment, the fragile, jagged breathing of the girl was the only thing that felt real in the cold marble fortress. She looked at him over her shoulder, her fear of his reputation warring with a grief so heavy she could no longer carry it alone. Aisha's attempt to retreat was a desperate scramble of fabric and frantic apologies, her small frame disappearing toward the servants' corridor before Dong-won could demand an explanation. He remained in the center of the room, the silence of the playroom returning to its oppressive, sterile norm. He was a man who lived by the rule of absolute order, yet the air felt agitated, stained by a genuine grief that his money couldn't simply scrub away. His gaze dropped to the floor where she had been huddled. There, resting against the leg of a hand-carved rocking horse, lay a small, crumpled square of paper. It was a blemish on the polished obsidian of his floor, a jagged disruption in his carefully guarded vacuum. Dongwon reached down, his large calloused hand marked with the subtle scars of his rise to power, retrieving the paper with a surgical precision. As he smoothed the sheet, the paper felt cheap and thin, a stark contrast to the heavy embossed stationery of the Mafia boss. The ink was smudged, likely by Aisha's tears, but the message was written in the unmistakable aggressive shorthand of the Seoul underworld. It wasn't a letter, it was a ledger of despair. It detailed a mounting debt, predatory interest rates, and a series of predatory threats targeting a family in a village far from the city's lights. The final line was a cold ultimatum, the kind of low-level brutality that Dongwon usually looked down upon from his high-rise throne. A cold, familiar fire began to stir behind his unreadable expression. He realized then that these wolves weren't just hunting in the slums, they had unknowingly followed their prey to the very gates of his sanctuary. To the loan sharks, Aisha was a disposable target with no defense. To Dongwon, she was a part of the household he protected with cold utility and absolute power. He stared at the name of the lending agency at the bottom of the page, a front for a bottom-feeding syndicate he had heard of but never deigned to acknowledge. He didn't feel a surge of pity. He felt a calculated, predatory protection rising within him. These men were making a mess in his house, and in Dongwon's world, messes were dealt with by a final payment that ensured they never happened again. He folded the letter into a neat, sharp rectangle and tucked it into the breast pocket of his black suit, his mind already shifting from the shadow in the doorway to an intelligence brief. The hunt had begun. The study was reclaimed by a silence so heavy it felt tangible, the crumpled letter now a weight against Dongwon's chest. He poured a glass of amber liquid, the ice clinking like a gavel in the stillness of the obsidian room. As the sharp scent of the spirit hit him, the polished walls of the penthouse seemed to bleed into the memory of a much smaller, darker room in the outskirts of Busan, a place where the air had always smelled of cheap cigarettes and cold sweat. He remembered a man, his own father, whose hands were never clean and whose voice was a constant low-frequency threat. To his father, a child's vulnerability was a security leak, a weakness that had to be beaten out until only the steel remained. Dongwon had learned to silence his own jagged breathing long before he learned to speak. He had watched as the wolves of his youth tore apart anything soft in their path, his father among them, believing that power was only true if it was used to inflict pain. His gaze drifted to the playroom door. Aisha's father was a world away, a man whose only crime was wanting a better life for a daughter who now wept in secret to pay for it. The loan sharks were using the same predatory threats his father once used to keep people small. They were counting on Aisha's silence and her father's helplessness. A cold, surgical resolve hardened in his chest, more lethal than the blunt brutality he had inherited. He was the head of a syndicate now, a man of absolute power, but he realized he did not want to be the echo of the man who had raised him. His father had been a destroyer of homes. Dongwon would be a silent guardian of his own. He would not allow another father to be broken by the same brand of cowardice that had haunted his childhood. He set the glass down, the liquid untouched. The ghosts of his past were no longer a source of shame, but a blueprint for his vengeance. He would use the very shadows and steel his father had forced upon him to dismantle the men who thought they could reach into his sanctuary and touch the life of a girl who made his daughter laugh. He reached for his secure phone, his unreadable expression shifting into the focus of a hunter. The wolves were hungry, but they had no idea they were howling at the door of a man who had mastered the dark long ago. The transition from a father's memory to a boss's calculation was seamless and cold. Dongwon returned to the obsidian desk, the crumpled letter smoothed out under the harsh glow of a minimalist lamp. He did not call his usual enforcers, the ones who handled the high-stakes port disputes or the political bribes. Instead, he summoned his lead analyst, a man whose expertise lay in the digital shadows where small parasitic debts were bought and sold. "Find them," Dongwon commanded, his voice a low vibration that carried no room for negotiation. He slid the thin paper across the desk. The target was a mid-level predatory lending firm, a pack of low-level bottom feeders who operated out of a nondescript office in a crumbling district of Seoul. They specialized in the quiet ruin of migrant families, banking on the fact that their victims were too terrified to seek help. They were small-time predators who had mistaken a lion's den for a grazing field. Dongwon watched the data stream by, the photos of the loan sharks, their sloppy bank records, their routine of intimidation. A $5,000 problem was usually solved with a wire transfer, but Dongwon intended to apply $50,000 worth of sophisticated psychological pressure. He began to deploy his resources with the same gravity he used for international mergers. He didn't just want the debt cleared, he wanted the agency's entire infrastructure to tremble at the mention of Aisha's name. He authorized the deployment of blacked-out SUVs to circle their office and the freezing of their auxiliary accounts through back-channel contacts. By morning, these men would realize they hadn't just tripped over a Maid, they had stepped onto a landmine buried in a monolith of polished obsidian. Dongwon leaned back, the unreadable expression returning to his face. He was treating a minor infection with a terminal dose of reality. The wolves were about to learn that in this city there was only one apex predator, and he was currently checking his daughter's homework in the room next door. The dining room was a cathedral of glass and cold marble, where the clink of silver against porcelain echoed with a lonely, hollow precision. Dongwon sat at the head of the long obsidian table, the city lights flickering behind him like a digital ghost, while his daughter sat small and silent to his right. The meal was, as always, a display of minimalist design, curated and perfect, yet entirely devoid of the heat of a home. Aisha entered from the kitchen, her footsteps silent against the expensive flooring. As she leaned in to set a porcelain tureen before him, the overhead chandelier caught the unmistakable puffiness of her red eyes and the way her skin looked sallow under the artificial glow. She moved with a fragile, jagged caution, her hands steady only by a visible effort of will. She was a wounded lamb trying to play the part of a ghost in a carefully controlled fortress. Dongwon watched her over the rim of his glass, his unreadable expression masking a sudden sharp clarity. In this sterile environment where every interaction was a transaction and every smile was a calculated move in a tax structure, Aisha was the only thing that felt real. Her grief was not a strategy, her fear was not a mask. She was the only person in his artificial world who wasn't trying to sell him a version of the truth. He noticed the way she lingered for a fraction of a second to adjust his daughter's napkin, a gesture of genuine care that no paycheck could ever buy. It was a connection that defied the cold utility of his empire. For the first time, the shadows and steel of his life felt like a cage rather than a throne. He looked at the woman he had viewed as a disposable employee and saw instead the light within his own home that he was now determined to protect with every ounce of his darkness. She finished her service and retreated into the shadows of the hallway, leaving him alone with his daughter and the silence that money buys. Dongwon didn't touch his food. His mind was already at the midnight visit he would soon pay to the men who thought they could dim the only flickering flame of humanity left in his house. The office of the lending agency was a cramped, neon-blurred room that smelled of stale smoke and unearned confidence. It was the kind of place where small men felt large by preying on those smaller than themselves. The three men inside were laughing over a ledger of predatory threats, their feet propped up on desks littered with the remnants of cheap takeout, until the door didn't just open, it ceased to be an obstacle. Dong Hwan stepped into the room, his black suit absorbing the sickly yellow light of the flickering fluorescent tubes. He didn't bring a frantic energy or a loud display of force. He brought the monolith of polished obsidian with him, a heavy, suffocating silence that made the oxygen in the room feel thin. The laughter died instantly. The man behind the main desk, a low-level predator with a gold chain and a nervous twitch, started to stand, a curse half-formed on his lips. He froze when he saw Dong Hwan's eyes, unreadable and colder than the winter air outside. Dong Hwan didn't wait for a greeting. He walked to the desk with a surgical grace, his movements a masterclass in controlled aggression. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the sharp folded rectangle of the letter he had taken from the playroom floor. He placed it on the desk, smoothing it out with one gloved hand. "The account for the girl," Dong Hwan said, his voice a low, resonant vibration that seemed to rattle the window panes. "It is settled." "Who the hell are you?" the man stammered, his hand creeping toward a drawer. Dong Hwan leaned forward, his unreadable expression shifting just enough to let the man see the shadows and steel within. He didn't use a gun, he simply placed a heavy black briefcase on the desk. When it clicked open, it didn't contain money, but a tablet displaying the private bank accounts, home addresses, and school routes of everyone in the room. It was $50,000 worth of intelligence used as a psychological guillotine. "You will take the payment I have already wired to your primary account," Dong Hwan whispered, the sound more terrifying than a shout. "Then you will delete her name. You will forget her face. If I hear her family has so much as a sleepless night because of you, I will return, and I will not bring a briefcase next time." No words were wasted. The wolves stared at the screen, their faces turning the color of ash as they realized they had accidentally tried to bite a ghost. Dong Hwan turned and walked out, the midnight visit concluded with a terrifying finality. He left the office door swinging on its hinges, the sterile piece of his world already beginning to mend the tear they had tried to make. The high-rise estate was still draped in the gray velvet of pre-dawn when the silence was broken by the frantic chime of a cell phone. Aisha, huddled in her small staff quarters, answered with a heart that hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She expected the raspy, threatening growl of the men from the letter, but instead she heard her father's voice, breathless, weeping, and light with an impossible joy. The words tumbled out of the receiver in a rush of relief. The men had come to the village not with fire or threats, but with a legal release and a notification that the entire debt had been settled by an anonymous benefactor. Not just the principal, but the interest, the penalties, the entire weight that had been crushing their lives was gone, as if it had never existed. Aisha sank to the edge of her narrow bed, her hand trembling so hard she almost dropped the phone. She listened to her father describe how the predators had looked terrified, behaving as if they were being watched by an invisible power before vanishing into the night. When the call ended, she sat in the dim light, overwhelmed by a fragile, jagged confusion. Relief washed over her in a cold, sweeping tide, but it was anchored by a profound mystery. She thought of the crumpled letter she had lost, and the shadow in the doorway she had encountered in the playroom. It seemed impossible that the feared head of a syndicate, a man who viewed the world through cold utility, would deign to notice her suffering, let alone fix it with such surgical finality. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling, neon-lit expanse of Seoul. Somewhere in the vast house, So Dong Hwan was likely awake, moving through his carefully controlled fortress with his usual unreadable expression. She felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of safety, a realization that the wolves had been driven back not by luck, but by a predatory protection she couldn't yet fully name. The tears that fell now were different. They were no longer the red eyes of grief, but the quiet, staggering realization that for the first time in her life, she was no longer alone in the dark. The morning sun cut through the reinforced glass of the estate, no longer casting long, predatory shadows, but painting the playroom in a rare golden warmth. Dong Huan approached the room with his usual silent footsteps, but he stopped short of the threshold. The fragile, jagged breathing that had haunted the corridors days ago had been replaced by a sound so foreign to the monolith of polished obsidian that it felt like a structural tremor, the sound of genuine, unbridled laughter. Inside, the minimalist design of the room had been surrendered to a chaotic, beautiful mess. Aisha was seated on the floor, no longer huddled or trying to disappear into the carpet. Her posture was relaxed, her red eyes now bright and clear as she helped Dong Huan's daughter build a sprawling, nonsensical fortress out of colorful blocks. The young girl was shrieking with delight, leaning into Aisha with a physical connection that Dong Huan had never been able to bridge with his offshore accounts or expensive gifts. Dong Huan stood in the shadow in the doorway, his unreadable expression beginning to soften at the edges. He watched the way Aisha moved, the way her hands, once shaking so violently, now guided his daughter's small fingers with a steady, nurturing grace. He realized then that his shadow campaign against the loan sharks had yielded a return far greater than the $5,000 he had erased. By using his darkness to protect the light in her, he had inadvertently brought that light back into his own carefully controlled fortress. Aisha looked up, her gaze meeting his. The primal terror that usually defined her expression when he entered was gone. In its place was a quiet, profound, unspoken bond, a look of mutual understanding that transcended the roles of master and servant. She didn't thank him aloud. She didn't have to. The visible mending of her spirit was written in the ease of her smile. Dong Huan leaned against the doorframe, adjusting his black suit as he watched his daughter lean her head against Aisha's shoulder. He had spent his life making investments in steel, land, and fear, believing that sentiment was weakness. But as he stood in the glow of the playroom, listening to the laughter that filled the sterile silence of his life, he realized this was the first time he had ever truly bought peace. It was his best investment, not for the Syndicate, but for the man he was slowly becoming. The following weeks saw a quiet revolution within the obsidian walls of the estate. The glass and cold marble remained, but the atmosphere had shifted, the sterile silence replaced by the humming of a household that finally breathed. Dong Huan sat in his study, the intelligence brief on the loan sharks replaced by a new permanent contract for Aisha, one that guaranteed her family's safety and her own future with a pay raise that defied the cold utility of his typical business dealings. He stood by the window, watching the sunset bleed over Seoul, but he no longer felt like a prisoner of his own luxury. He realized that for years he had been building a fortress to keep the world out, only to find himself trapped in the sterile vacuum of his own making. He had thought that power was found in the shadows and steel of his syndicate, but the visible mending of the past few days had taught him a different truth. A home wasn't defined by its soundproofing or its minimalist design. It was built by the people you chose to pull out of the darkness. A light knock sounded at the door, not the sharp, rhythmic rap of a lieutenant, but a softer, more genuine sound. Aisha entered, carrying a tray of tea. She didn't look at the floor as she approached. Her posture was controlled and authoritative in her own right, born of a newfound dignity. As she set the cup down, their eyes met in a brief, unspoken bond of mutual respect. The fear that once defined their interaction was gone, replaced by a quiet loyalty that money could never have bought. "Thank you, Aisha," he said, his voice low and resonant. She nodded once, a small, knowing smile touching her lips before she retreated to the playroom where his daughter was waiting.
Dong Huan watched her go, realizing that his best investment had finally paid off. He was still the feared head of a syndicate, but within these walls, he had established a new rule. He was no longer just a boss or a predator. He was a guardian. He sat back, picking up a crayon drawing his daughter had made of the three of them, a messy, colorful disruption to his carefully controlled fortress, and for the first time in his life, he didn't mind the mess at all.